So we may begin.
Just give me 1 minute.
Sure, sir.
Venkat sir, I think another presenter, Suramya, has joined. We can make her the co-host.
Yeah, we can start now. I can make.
Okay, it's live.
So should we start?
Yeah, you can start.
All right. Good afternoon to one and all present here. I hope you're all keeping safe and healthy. I welcome you all to this national webinar on multidisciplinary approaches to folk life, challenges and perspectives, organized by the Department of Modern Indian Languages and Literary Studies, University of Delhi. It gives me immense pleasure to introduce myself as the moderator for this 12th session of this webinar. My name is Shruti and I am a PhD research fellow in the Department of Modern Indian Languages and Literary Studies, University of Delhi, under my able guide, Dr. Govind Swami Rajgopal sir. I'm currently working on the representation of sex workers in Indian narratives. So that's about me, and keeping up with the time constraints, I'd like to introduce you all to the framework and the rules for this particular session. So there'd be 4 paper presentations in this session. Each of the paper presenters shall have 20 minutes for their presentation. A reminder will be given to you around 2 to 3 minutes before your designated time slot gets over. And each of the presentations will be followed by a 10-minute feedback session or discussion or question answer round. All the attendees, the audience, everyone is encouraged to keep writing their questions in the chat box while the presentation is going on, so that we can constructively use the time and not wait after the paper is over and then we're waiting for questions to come in. So you can pour in your feedback and comments and questions while the paper is going on also in the chat box. Also, all the discussion will take place via the chat box only and not directly in contact. Each of the presenters are requested to introduce themselves before beginning their presentation, and all the other attendees are requested to keep their audios muted during the session for smooth conduction of the webinar. Now, with kind permission of the faculty present here, the head of the department and the convener of the seminar, Professor P.S. Patnaik sir, could not join us for this session, but with the permission of Dr. Venkat Ramaya sir, the technical facilitator, I'd like to start today's session and invite our first presenter. So with your due permission, sir, may I?
Please continue.
Yeah. So our first presenter today is Swasti Sharma, and her paper is titled Gender Performativity and Folklife, Reconstructing African American Aesthetics Through the Blues. Over to you, Swasti.
Thank you, Shruti. Thank you, sir. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Okay. Myself, Swasti Sharma, I teach in the Department of English, Satyavati College, University of Delhi. And a very good afternoon to all the esteemed members of the organizing committee and the audience. At the outset, let me begin by expressing my gratitude towards the organizing committee of this national webinar, the Department of Modern Indian Languages and Literary Studies, for giving me an opportunity to present my research paper. And as you are aware, my paper is entitled Gender Performativity and Folklife, Reconstructing African American Aesthetics Through the Blues. I'll begin by sharing my screen now. I hope it's visible.
It is.
Yeah, thank you. So my paper, this particular research paper, moves away from the conventional indigenous terrain and turf. My engagement with the African American canonical and non-canonical Uber propelled me to expand what Yaus would call the horizon of expectations and to gauge the folk in the African American context through the prism of what Hans George Gadamer would later on call the hermeneutic ontology. Hermeneutics Hermeneutics, as a research methodology of interpretation, is concerned with the aporia or the logical disjunct that arises when dealing with the explicable or the inexplicable, human actions and the ramifications of such actions, most importantly, the text. As a methodological discipline, it bestows the readers with a toolbox for efficiently addressing the problems pertaining to the interpretation of human actions, texts, and other meaningful material. Hermeneutics looks back at the long tradition as a set of problems it addresses, which have been prevalent in the human life hitherto and repeatedly and consistently called for consideration. Interpretation, therefore, is a ubiquitous activity unfolding whenever humans aspire to grasp whatever interpretanda or the interpretation they deem significant. Due to its long history, it is only natural that both its problems and the tools designed to solve that particular problem have shifted considerably over time, along with the discipline of hermeneutics itself. Some of the crucial questions in this regard are: number one, who is the author, quis or persona? What is the subject matter of the text, quid materia? What was the text written about, cur or causa? How was the text composed, quomodo or modus? When was the text written or published, quando or tempus? Where was the text written or published, ubi or loco? By which means was the text written or published, quibius facultiabus or facultas? These are some of the ancillary questions that a paper would delve into, but let me state the fundamental hypothesis of the paper first. One of the most noteworthy observations on the contribution of blues women to Black feminist theory was offered by Angela Davis in Blues, Legacies, and Black Feminism. She says, and I quote, "Through the emergence of the professional blues singer, a predominantly female figure accompanied by a small and large instrumental ensembles as a part of the rise of the Black entertainment industry, this individualized mode of presenting popular music crystallized into a performance culture that has had an enduring influence on the African American music. The two keywords that you can draw from here are the female figure and the performance culture, which remains central not just to the performativity of gender, as Judith Butler would call it, but also the objective correlative of their predicament in the then spatiotemporal milieu. The idiosyncratic African American blues transformed into the quintessential signifier of the resistance against the racial discrimination in the 20th century. The raison d'etre of the early Black artistic struggle was the construction of a unified Black aesthetic. Female blues singers were the pioneers of race music. Classic vaudeville blues was in vogue in the 1920s. Gertrude Mulroney and Bessie Smith were instrumental in determining the influence of the performative blues. Most of the research work which has been conducted till now on the blues women limits the analysis to them as performers in the 1920s and the voyeurism to which these women were subjected. Angela Davis, again in Blues Legacies and Black Feminism, has pointed out, and I quote, sexuality was one of the most tangible domains in which the emancipation was acted upon and through which the meanings were expressed, unquote. By the 1960s, the declining classical blues was replaced with the predominantly masculine urban blues. Blues purists metamorphosed into the vanguards of authentic race music. This genre, which has originated on the plantations in the Deep South, has witnessed the milestones in the African American quest for individualism. The research paper will primarily address the absence of scholarship in the realm of Black feminist blues. The established aesthetics does not dwell on the reflection of folk life in blues music. The genre is the living embodiment of traditions and practices which constitute the African American lived experience. The research paper will closely examine the aspect of gender performance in the blues, which has informed the cultural memory of women of color in the United States. And in addition, since the 1960s, what we have seen is that the folkloristic approaches in the Northern America have been conceptualized in tandem with the keywords of practice and performance. Yet such theorizations develop fractures due to the heterogeneity of approaches. The adjunct performance theories, which also stemmed from the upheaval, differ in the use of explanation or generalization, often contradicting the aggregate of folk behavior. A deeper analysis of such trajectories indicated a more expansive potential of practice theory in folklore and folklife studies, especially when these studies are oriented towards a mobile ethnography of everyday life. The scope for the aforementioned disciplinary approach, the trajectory of Black feminist discourse, and the need for a robust archiving are some of the ancillary concerns that would contour the discourse. Let me now furnish a brief background of the emergence of jazz and blues as the repertoire not just of the artistic expression, but that of the unhyphenated African American woman's lived experience. The advent of various forms of jazz and blues, such as the rock and roll, the funk, offered more liberal insight into being of the African American community as a whole. The collective consciousness of the African Americans is based on the racial memory. Billie Holiday's Strange Fruit in 1939 registered its protest against the lynching of African Americans. The abominable photograph depicting the brutal assassination of Thomas Shipp and Abram Smith revived the horror and disgust while concomitantly triggering the memory of the plight during the period of slavery. It is the cultural hegemony that defines and distinguishes the marginalized from the mainstream. This, wittingly or unwittingly, conjures the existential crisis which has informed the folk life of the ghettoized African American. The folk is a narration of not just the individual, but the commune. The songs that these women sung The songs that these women sung widely discuss the vulnerability of the chastised Black body and the ease with which the Black people were transformed into the prime targets of atrocities in a predominantly white America. Billy's satirical tone rather, mocked the gallant South, which was the center of the notorious Jim Crow laws that constituted the backbone of racism. The primary objective of these songs was to actually subvert the authority of the white dominant institutions. Blues, in particular, is a music genre and a musical form which originated in the deep south of the United States around the 1860s by the African Americans, obviously composed by the African Americans from the roots in African musical tradition, African American work songs, and spirituals. Blues incorporated spirituals, work songs, field hollers, shouts, chants, and rhyme simple narrative ballads. These blues forms, ubiquitous in jazz, rhythm and blues and rock and roll, is characterized by the call and response pattern, the blues scale and specified chord progressions, of which 12-bar blues is the most common. These are some of the specifics pertaining to how the blues is constructed. Blue notes or the worried notes, usually thirds, fifths, or seventh flattened in pitch, are also an essential part of the sound. Blues shuffle or bass reinforce the trance-like rhythm and form a repetitive, effective known as the groove. Blues as a genre is also characterized by its lyrics, bass lines, and instrumentations. Early traditional blues verses, they were consisting of a single line repeated 4 times. It was only in the first decade of the 20th century that most common current structure became standard, the AAB pattern, consisting of a line sung over 4 first bars, its repetition over the next 4, and then longer concluding line over the last bar. Many elements, such as the call and response format and the use of blues notes, can be traced back to the music of Africa. The origins of the blues are also closely related to the religious music of the Afro American community, the spirituals. The first appearance of the blues is often dated to after the ending of slavery and later the development of juke joints. It is associated with the newly acquired freedom and of the former slaves. Uh, Chroniclers began to report about the blues music at the dawn of the 20th century. The first publication of blues sheet music was in 1908. Blues has since evolved from unaccompanied vocal music and oral traditions of slaves into a wide variety of styles and subgenres. Blues subgenres include country blues, such as the Delta blues, Piedmont blues, and as well as the urban blues styles, such as Chicago blues and the West Coast blues. World War II also had a significant impact and marked a transition from the acoustic to the electrical blues and progressive opening of the blues music to a wider audience, especially the white learners and listeners. In the 1960s and 70s, a hybrid form of blues, rock and roll, developed, which blended blues styles with rock music. Blues women contributed to this tradition by reintroducing syncopation or the variation in rhythms. The spectacle was integral to the performance. The gestures and movements associated with the performance made these blues women the center of the Black aesthetic in the roaring 20s. Many of the blues written by women tended to deal with the themes such as the loss of control over their lives, traveling away from bad relationship, or loneliness. However, violence, fear, retribution, disease, and poor health, as well as natural disasters, were sung about. For example, Spivey's blues lamented deaths caused by the dreaded disease tuberculosis, which plagued poor people, especially men and women of color. In the other songs, she had also commented on the squalor of New York prisons, known as the tombs. Nina Simone in Mississippi Goddam, which was composed in 1963, as you can see on the screen, celebrated the courage of Black community, which was combating racial prejudice for centuries but remained optimistic. The song was written in protest against the murder of Medgar Evers in June 1963 by Klansmen. She has written the following lines, and I would just like to recite them. Oh, but this whole country is full of lies. You all are going to die like flies. I don't trust you anymore. You keep on saying go slow. Go slow. But that's just the trouble. Do it slow, desegregation. Do it slow, mass participation. Do it slow, reunification. Do it slow. Do things gradually, do it slow, but bring more tragedy. Do it slow. Why don't you see it? Why don't you feel it? I don't know. I don't know. You don't have to live you don't have to live next to me. Just give me my equality. Everybody knows about Mississippi. Everybody knows about Alabama. Everybody knows about Mississippi. Goddamn. That's it. This systematic marginalization of the figure of blues woman in African American literary domain during the 1960s became more prominent, which can be inferred from the comparative assessment of visibility and incorporation of the lived experience of female blues singers in the in the African American canon before and after the Black Arts movement. Some of the key texts that have been comprehensively engaged with the marginalization and dilemma of blues women are Not Without a Laughter in the 1930, Their Eyes Were Watching God 1937, Invisible Man 1952, and Sonny's Blues 1957. The social construct of binaries of gender ensues from the anxiety of performing gender roles. Judith Butler had noted in Gender Trouble, and I quote, the effect of gender is produced through the stylization of body and hence must be understood as the mundane way in which bodily gestures, movements, and styles of various kinds constitute the illusion of an abiding gendered self. This formulation moves the conception of gender off the ground into a substantial model of identity to one that requires a conception of gender as the constituted social temporality. She continued, if gender attributes and acts, the various ways in which body shows or produces its cultural significations are performative, then there is no pre existing identity by which an act or attribute might be measured. There would be no true or false, real or distorted acts of gender, and the postulation of a true gender identity would be revealed as a regulatory fiction. This gender reality is created through the sustained social performances means that very notions of an essential sex and a true or abiding masculinity or femininity are also constituted as a part of strategy that conceals gender performative character and the performative possibilities for proliferating gender configurations outside the restricting frames of masculinist domination and compulsory heterosexuality, unquote. The dominant social structure is contingent upon not just the propagation of heterosexism or phallogocentrism, which attempt to augment themselves through the constant repetition of their logic, their metaphysic, but also the angs of existence. This mechanism of cultural reproduction of identities, or what Walter Benjamin would recognize as the mechanical reproduction of the self through the otherization, is central to the contemporary folk life. The question then emerges, which I want the audience to ponder, what kind of subversive repetition might call into question the regulatory practice of identity itself. Perhaps the African American musical tradition may introduce a new perspective in this regard. African American musical tradition has placed a high premium on the performance of the self through ethnomusicology. The raison d'etre of the early Black artistic struggle was premised on the formation and sustenance of the Black aesthetic. The theorist Larry Neal proclaimed in 1968 that the Black arts were the aesthetic and spiritual sister of the Black power concept, and argued that the younger writers and artists should confront the contradictions which are arising out of the African Americans' experience of racism and marginalization in the West. The development of the Black aesthetic was seen as crucial to the development of the African American identity at this revolutionary moment in American politics. Artists were called upon to seek a new aesthetic in opposition to the Western white one and not to ignore their Black communities. Early artworks took forms of murals that confronted social issues and sought to galvanize local Black communities. There were colorful and rich symbolic imageries, often depicting the members of the Black community, from jazz musicians to politicians. Artists associated with the Black aesthetic included the visual arts workshop, the examples being Gary Rickson, William Walker, etc. But there is one more important thing that Larry Neal has noted in the context of the Black aesthetics. He says, and I quote, when we speak of the Black aesthetic, several things are meant. First, we assume that there is already in existence the base for such an aesthetic. Then essentially it consists of an African American cultural tradition. But this aesthetic is finally, by implication, a broader than that tradition. It encompasses most of the usable elements of the third world culture. The motive behind the black aesthetic is the destruction of the white thing, the destruction of the white ideas, and the white ways of looking at the world. The new aesthetics is mostly predicated on an ethics which asks the question, whose vision of the world is finally more meaningful, ours or that of the white oppressors? What is truth? Or more precisely, whose truth shall we express? That of the oppressed or of the oppressor? I think these are some important questions that need to be contemplated and articulated. Then again, what we have seen through the subsequent years is the decline.
Swasti, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think I just want to remind you you'll have to wrap up in maybe 1 or 2 minutes max.
Yeah. I'll just wrap up in a couple of minutes. So what we have seen in the subsequent years after the 1960s is the decline of blues from energetic idealism to and communal hopefulness to dictatorial cynicism and widespread misogyny, which have adversely affected the blues genre. So although the first ones to record the blues were the Black women themselves, blues purists now in after the 1960s and 70s assumed the role of the gatekeepers of the Black identity to undermine the authenticity of the African American woman's ordeal. Gender issue was seen as an impediment to the race struggle. The Black liberation struggle was integral to the patriarchal project. And there was a certain castration fear also, which we find in Richard Rice's Bigger Thomas, due to the historical stereotyping of the Black man. And what we have seen is that because of this, there is a psychological fragmentation, which became a part of the race music, the African American music in particular, and which has now defined the race relations in the United States, although it is still informed by the autobiographical memory and the ethnomusicological tradition. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Swasti. That was indeed a very insightful presentation, I must say. You very carefully sketched out the chronology of the origin and spread of the blues, and you it's my takeaway that you talked about these tales, these songs and tales of, as form of expressions of the form of expression, form of resistance, form of protest, form of complaining, and in a way creating in a way creating safe space for oneself. But one thing that kind of confuses me, and it is also one of the questions here. I would just read out the question. Is some of the references in your presentation belong to the domain of popular more than the folk. So, how have you arrived at an understanding of these songs as part of folklore?
Yeah, one thing I just wanted to mention about the first point that you had, the first comment that you had with respect to my presentation, which was the protest. Now, what is intriguing about the blues and the performativity of the blues, especially when we take into account the blues women, is that they were protesting against the protest. Now, that is what makes their expression so significant, because African American canon in itself is a form of protest writing. And what African American women writers as well as musicians did was to protest against this form of protest. So they were creating a subaltern group through that. The second thing is that how do you differentiate between the popular and the folk? Now, the problem is that we create these watertight compartments into which we deem all the music, all the creativity, and the literature. The point is that when I began with the presentation, I talked about one very significant thing, that these forms of music emerged from the plantations in the deep south, and they do not just, we see them in the realm of the contemporary, but they have a long tradition and history from which these traditions have unfolded themselves. And how do we have the knowledge of the same? The archaeology of knowledge from which they ensue is something which is very traditional and folk, because if you see the plantation culture in the deep south, they emerged as the spiritual. They emerged through through the expression of the predicament to which they were subjected. I'm sorry. So therefore, it has that element of the folk which it has retained. But again, you have to cater to the contemporary audience, which makes it a bit popular. So I hope that answers the question.
All right. So that was the question by Pavitra, and she has a comment in continuation to that. She says, folklore is not always about protest. Would you like to comment on that?
Well, partially I do agree that it is not always about the protest. Because there is an attempt also to preserve the cultural knowledge that has been acquired through the course of years. So there is also that kind of assimilative impulse that we have. But what we see in the African American context in particular, because you cannot simply say that all folk life is homogeneous, so therefore the heterogeneity of it has to be also accepted, and it also has to be contemplated in that regard. And what I believe is that the African American experience is quite different. That is why I began with the statement that it's different from the conventional indigenous experience to which we find ourselves relating. And therefore, it makes it so unique, because you cannot, compare it simply with some other experience. You have to, accept and also appreciate its uniqueness in that regard.
That's true. To that, Ruchi Rana has a comment. Folklore is everything. The way of life involves resistance and protest too. Meanings change from context to context. So, yeah.
Yeah. And one more thing, if before I end, if you could just allow me a couple of minutes,
Sure.
which is that a very significant thing that I have observed through the course of my research is that it is not just about the meaning, because the meaning and significance in African American literature are two very different things. They are sometimes they are diametrically opposite to each other. So the phenomena is such that to deconstruct the meaning does not necessarily mean that you are going to assert a significance. So therefore, the two would be different as well. So that is something about the African American folklore and the African American music that I simply appreciate to the fullest. Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity. Yeah.
Thank you so much for bringing the African American aesthetics element to this folklore discussion, because most often we tend to ignore the non-Indian parts, the non-Indian elements of it. So thank you for bringing that in light. And it was indeed a very insightful presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
With that, I'd like to now invite our next presenters. The paper is titled Bhojpuri Women's Songs of Migration. Gavna Karai Saiya Ghar Bait Wale Apne Chalela Pardes. And this will be presented by Surmaiya Gosain and Yashika Kant. Over to you.
A very warm welcome to all the dignitaries present here. Surmaiya Gosai and I, Yashika Kant, are final year master's students in the English Department of University of Delhi. It is a great privilege for us to be a part of this webinar. Our paper is titled Gauna Karai Saiya Ghar Baithavale Apne Chaleha Pardes, Bhojpuri Women's Songs of Migration. We shall now begin. For the Bhojpuri-speaking parts of eastern UP and western Bihar, migration has always been a reality for centuries. Male-out migration is a phenomena that is not transitory but absolutely central to Bhojpuri lives. Bhojpuri society has been so deeply characterized by migration that it has come to become a frame of reference for all its cultural formulations and produced creative subjects. The process of labor out migration in Bhojpuri peasant society marks a creative peak in the history of oral cultural productions, especially in folk music. In Bhojpuri folk songs, the migrant and his left behind wife are immediately recognizable tropes, the latter being the protagonist in most folk songs sung by both women and men. While there is considerable research on various aspects of migration, there is sparse literature on the impact of this migration on people, especially on women who are left behind in the villages. Bhikhari Thakur's seminal work on Bidesiya theatre established the cultural ramifications of the phenomena in the region. For all the remarkable work done on the field, studies on Bidesiya theatre and Bidesiya culture remained fairly masculine in nature. Although they acknowledged women as bearers of oral culture, their formulations failed to factor in their voices. Asha Singh, in her study of Bhojpuri folk music, argues how the scholars of Bidesiya spoke of women as subjects or characters alone and not as creators of culture. This paper explores the contours of those negotiations. Narayan writes how folklorists and sociologists have identified folk songs as reservoirs of women's said and unsaid expressions. Most folk tales are sung by men, in which the migrant's wife usually conforms to an ideal image. But those sung by women are more aware of the livid practicality of being left behind. In the absence of men, several responsibilities have to be shouldered by women, which involve a wide array of roles. In this process, women have to, on the one hand, emotionally suffer separation, while on the other, endure familial and social oppression, which often includes sexual threats as well. Usually, women whose husbands migrate become repositories of sorrow who wait endlessly. However, women's songs clearly rationalize this longing in the context of material and social hardships in the absence of the husband. Women's songs discuss unequal source positions, describing curtailed physical access to resources within families, communities, and households in the context of migration. For instance, in the following excerpt, Toharo je Maya Prabhu ho avari chinariya ho, from a Jatsari song, the woman is complaining to her migrant husband who has just returned home. Oh husband, your mother is such a bitch. She gives me only a few drops of oil. Oh husband, your sister is such a bitch. She gives me limited flour to cook. Drawing on Nivedita Menon's argument of limited fields of power play for women within the household, the song is a playing out of that power. The limited access to oil or flour, often mediated through other female members of the household, is an essentially understandable feature. Scholarship on migration hasn't spoken about these finer strains and readjustments in the spatial domain of the household and the body. On the other hand, Bhojpuri women folk songs are filled with such instances and work to bring them to the fore. In another song, Runjhun Kholna Kevariya Hum Bideswa Jaivona, the communication between the husband and the wife is a dynamic and lively duet. The husband wants to migrate and requests his wife to unlock the door, who asks to be sent off to her natal home. In a powerful articulation of the force of women's unregistered, unpaid labor in a husband's house, when the husband asks for a repayment of all the money he has spent on her until now, the wife cleverly asks for a repayment of a chastity that she has paid with since then, leaving the husband speechless. In other songs, even if the wife agrees to her husband leaving, she shares her worries with her husband of losing interest in household chores or for him to adjust in a big city. In one of the songs, Kalkatwa tu Jaan Ja Raja, Hamar Dil Kaise Lagi, the wife warns the husband from taking off to Calcutta, as it is imagined to be full of prostitutes, dotted with pan and cigarette shops, and rampant with malaria. The shift from her natal to conjugal home after marriage has been seen as a migration in itself, and it presents a history true for almost the entire world. To top her own dislocated context, when a husband has to depart, the wife has no one to talk about her desolation. The husband, no doubt, becomes a stranger in an unknown land, uprooted from his own world, but his wife too feels like a stranger in the emptied household. When she was in her natal home, she could take a walk in the field, she could enjoy the swings with her friends. But here, with her in-laws, the house and the courtyard are the only accessible areas. In a distant land where her husband is imprisoned within the clutches of his Malik, She lies here under the surveillance of her in-laws and other relatives. The separation from her own family and migration of her husband makes her feel like a migrant too. Songs like Chotki Gotaniya Mare Tanwa Ka Batiya Ke Batiya highlight how very often harassment comes from female friends and women relatives as well if the bride wishes to settle somewhere else with her child, leaving the joint family. Based on the letter format, this song sings of a migrant wife's Rajmatiya who is being taunted by her younger sister-in-law, and so Rajmatiya is having a letter written to her husband. She writes to tell him that she received the 80 rupees he had sent, but that won't suffice. The girls have grown older and need one thing or the other. Mangra goes to school every day, but he broke the Maulviji's lock recently. The goat is bleating as she's feeling cold, and the calf's selling price has not been decided. The wife asks for her husband's advice. She wants the news of the entire neighborhood to be written down in the letter. It is clear how all his worries and hopes are pinned to the village. He is the absent patriarch, called on to take decisions from afar. Responsibilities become profound with the birth of a child. By the time she has conceived, she has spent considerable time in her in-laws' household and has become accustomed with its conditions. The surveillance of her in-laws seems to have slackened, but even then she is helpless in some ways. In the song, Sut Sut Baua, Koi Maike Dabua, Baap Gaile Nokri, the helplessness of a new mother finds expression. The absence of the husband has a direct impact on the negotiation of the wife at all levels, domestic, community, and neighborhood. If she is childless or has mothered only girls, the absence of the husband adds up to her material difficulty, as other members of the conjugal family are seldom willing to spend on or for her. Even the natal family members are reluctant to take responsibility of married daughters. Following Rupani's song, Baba Ho Kate, Dana Duidas, Dinwa Nuho, Tale Prabhuji Lavati Ayan Ho describes such a situation. The absence of the husband or the process of migration seems to legitimize the act of singing of sexual desires, and it is often repeated motive. However, there are several shades to the sexual in Bhojpuri folk songs, always in tandem with the social and economical vulnerabilities of migration. There are images of sexual desires, betrayal, disappointments, and fantasies. The sexual is culturally produced in these songs through a set of metaphor. One of the prominent metaphors is that of Gauna. Gauna is a post-marriage ritual where the woman is brought from her natal home to her marital home. This ritual marks her puberty and is symbolic of the consummation of marriage. Usually, the woman challenges her husband by reminding him that Gauna has been performed and he cannot run away from his consummation duties. These songs perceive migration after Gauna as a conjugal sexual betrayal. The narrative of the folk song legitimizes a woman's revenge and sarcasm in the context of an unfulfilled marriage. However, these emotions are shaped within socially sanctioned structures of caste and gender. The song Gauna Karai Saiya Ghar Baithawale Apne Chalela Pardes captures the anger and consequent revenge of a left behind wife on the return of her migrant husband. The songs also voice the sexual vulnerabilities of the migrant's left behind wife. The woman's brother-in-law or the devar is a common seducer in the songs from whom she seeks protection. In asking the husband for this protection, the seduction motive also becomes a means to assert the chastity of the woman. On the other hand, in certain songs, the woman is portrayed as having alternative sexual alliances leading to pregnancies. Krishna Deva Upadhyay, in his writings on Bhojpuri folk culture, has framed the former as sati and latter as kulta. The sati image is held as a rule, while the kulta image has been discussed as an outlier. The point to note here is that songs which conform to notions of chastity are sung in the domestic realms, like the Jatsari songs. Though Jatsari is not caste specific, it has been generally associated with Savarna households. While songs of agricultural processes, Rupani and Sohani, are sung by women of lower castes. Women folk songs voice their anxieties regarding migrant men's alternative sexual conjugal arrangements at the destinations of migration. The co-wife is a recurring character in Bhojpuri folk songs. In the songs, the protagonist often challenges the wrongful desires of her husband. However, the alternative conjugal spaces are clearly beyond the reach and control of these left behind women. Bhojpuri folk literature is rich with imageries of monogamous and devotional love, be it in the Banijia folk songs sung by Kevat and Dome heroines, Bihula, Lachhiya, Dev Sundari, or in the ballads of Parvati. In one Banijia folk song, Lord Shiva comes back from his 12-year-long tour, and rather than inquiring how his wife has been in his absence, he grills her about how pure she still is. A famous Shiv Gaudi song, Lavangiya Ladaniya Ho Mahadev, sung by women during weddings, bears testimony to the systematic way in which a husband is sanctioned to suspect the sexual purity of the wife, and that there is an old and well established tradition of examining the wife to clear his doubts. It is therefore established as a legitimate demand on part of the husband. Bhojpuri society has congealed a helpless character of a bride as its ideal through its literature, and is more or less the same picture in the literature of all castes and classes. But it is in this same region that certain castes have given preeminence to the social reality and overcome the tension of their oppressed history and exploitative culture. In the songs of working class women, so-called purity of women is often derided. These women contribute equally to the production process as their men, and so share a different kind of relationship than women of other castes. But often the uniqueness of caste-based sociality is not entirely clear in the songs. Women of God, Nat, and other Dalit castes contribute equal labor as does a man, and so in the face of oppression become vocal critics of social customs. This is not to say that social and cultural beliefs have been completely obliterated in their case. In the song, Fool ek fooli gaile, fuleva va dabanwa piya more gaile bideswa, a gowed woman is looking on the blossoming of a donna flower and laments her separation from her husband, who left her right after their wedding. She curses the one who has caused her this pain, wishing that his legs start to ache while he walks to foreign lands, and wishes that the hands with which he put vermilion on her forehead go numb. She further threatens to smash her shell bangles and rub the vermilion off of her. To this, the husband beseeches her to not to do so and promises that he will not leave her side. In some songs sung by the Nat caste, the heroine becomes pregnant due to illegitimate sexual relationships. In Banijia, in Sipahiya and Sipahiya folk traditions on migration, we often see that the migrant husband kills the pregnant wife or she is driven out of the home. In the famous Banijia folk tale of Shobh Naik, the pregnant woman is driven out of her husband's home, even though she has conceived her husband's offering from their intimacy on the wedding night. But her in-laws do not listen to her and force her to leave. In folk literary traditions, we see a sympathetic depiction of such women who are made to live outside the village and with a forced labor of collecting dry leaves from the forests imposed on them. In the songs sung by men and upper caste women, the migrants' wives are not seen to protest the punishment meted out to them. But in the songs of lower caste class women, songs do bring out the voices of protest and even show signs of rebellion. The Left Behind Woman is not just the creative subject of women's folk songs alone, but features in men's songs as well. Like women's songs, even in men's song, the women protagonist appears in first person feminine. The absence of the first person masculine in Bhojpuri folk songs in narrating experiences of migration is fascinating. While men's songs discuss the co-wife to spice up the narrative, women's song discuss it as a social problem which affects her status and leads to further deprivation. Politics of survival is strongly linked with the politics of intimacy in women's folk songs. Unlike men's genres that are limited to romantic portrayal of desire, women's songs go beyond the desire and draw a strong connection between the material and the sexual. In other words, women's songs reveal the politics of hurt, which hardly becomes a subject of men's songs. In a Jatsari folk song, Balo mein gohua upji gaile Ankdi, we see that a man has brought home a Purvi Bengalin woman as his new wife. The man goes off to work in the field while his first wife, in consultation with her elder sister-in-law, offers the new wife poisoned food. Her head starts spinning when she eats, and so she goes and lies down. When her husband comes back from the field and sees everybody but her, he inquires where she is. His first wife replies that the new wife is vain and lazy and that she has slept off. The husband is quite angry to hear this and dashes off to the place where his wife was sleeping and hits her twice with penna, the metallic object with which the bullocks are controlled by plowing. The wife does not speak, obviously, because she has already died. It is important to note that folk songs are performed in gender segregated spaces. In Bhojpuri regions, women folk songs are performed in women's exclusive spaces. Men may listen to these songs from a distance, but they do not constitute the legitimate audience. In addition, there is no such divide as a performer and audience in folk song society. Women sing for other women and with women. Similarly, men sing for other men as audience with men, though they might be singing about the pain and sufferings of women. There is a disjuncture between gendered conjugal spaces and folk songs and gendered conjugal spaces in reality. Folk songs, with their tailored autonomy, puncture and blur certain notions of public and private. This is done by imagining conversational conjugal spaces in the text. The disjunctures between the lived geographies and imagined geographies in folk songs tell us stories of women's subjectivity, agency, and helplessness. Women sing what they cannot often actualize or implement in real lives. Folk songs become autonomous spaces, which gives women a certain degree of poetic license to index her grievances, complaints, and aspirations. Looking at the content of Bhojpuri women's folk songs, one can infer that these songs emerged as markers of protest. In Bhojpuri peasant society, folk songs also provide such spaces where women can question and confront their men. They expose the status of women in caste patriarchal structure, but they cannot change it as women's agency and assertions are conditioned by dominant cultural assumptions. There is disjuncture in the images of life in folk songs, which is an integral part of the way Bhojpuri society is designed. However, in spite of the larger reality of being left behind, these folk songs have responded to the changes in new and creative ways. The changes can be observed through the changing vocabulary and metaphors in the folk songs with migration motif. Mode of communication has always been a prominent motif in the songs with migration. Earlier it was the letter, now it has been replaced by mobile phone, which is a symbol of pride. Where does the man go? This question has
Excuse
been...
me. I'm sorry to interrupt, but you'll have to wrap it up in next 2 to 3 minutes.
Okay, sure. Where does the man go? This question has been dealt with in women's songs since the very beginning. The difference is that in older songs, migration destinations were imagined within frames of ambiguity. However, in the present day songs, one can find names of cities like Delhi, Ludhiana, etc., indicating increased spatial awareness among women due to communication technology. The neoliberal structured transformation and intercommunicative services have facilitated greater labor out migration from Bhojpuri peasant society. It might have improved the economic status of migrants as they are equipped with mobile phones and are capable of buying land back home. However, the left behindedness is a continuing reality for women. The remittance has not brought much qualitative change in lower caste peasant women's life. Especially the lower caste peasant women are fixed in their conjugal homes, looking after the children, the aged, the agricultural land, if there is any. They are still unlettered and not just left behind by their men, but also left behind by the process of modernity. So our paper ends here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was indeed a very interesting topic, and even the presentation was very interesting. I really appreciate some of the points that you pointed out, how these songs reveal the politics of hurt, how you pointed out the knowledge of names of different cities when it starts appearing in the songs, how that reflects on their personal gain in a sense. So congratulations on the wonderful presentation. I'll just invite comments and questions. Punita here says, it's very interesting how the tropes of migration The women's being tortured at home by female in-laws, including her surveillance, is extremely similar to Haryanvi Jakri's. So that's a comment. Would you like to
Yes.
talk about that?
I think we had a presentation on this yesterday,
Yeah,
and ma'am was talking about it. So I guess the atrocities that women face is similar across all cultures. So, so the similarity is definitely it's
yeah,
going.
the
Yeah,
similarity of lived experiences.
yeah.
Yeah. I would like to invite more questions and comments if people have it. You're being complimented by Ms. Priyanka Datta. A very interesting presentation. So yeah, that's a
Thank
compliment.
you.
Thank you.
If there are no more questions, or while more questions come, maybe you could, I would request you to talk about, how while these songs come from a collective space of lived experiences, and they in a way talk about sisterhood also and everything, but do you also feel that somewhere they also talk a lot about women rivalry and against women concept? So would you like to maybe talk something about that? Because out of all the examples you gave, I could not stop myself from noticing. For
Yes.
example, there was this song wherein the woman is complaining to her husband not to go to Calcutta because there are sex workers there, right? And so talking ill about someone's profession or just sex work in general, which again I understand comes from the politics of hurt, but overall also, there is kind of hint of women against women idea. So would you like to comment on that?
I think Suramya can answer if she.
Yes, certainly. This was something that we were also discussing when we were working on this paper. When we say that there's a community of women who are coming together, singing about similar experiences, there is power in that. But simultaneously, also there are subjects of that patriarchal structure themselves. So it is not to say an all feminist space where they are, they are aware of or conscious of this kind of rivalry that they are also simultaneously hurling against other women. But yes, that's certainly true. What you said is all true. That there's not a conscious this thing of when my I am being oppressed, so is the other woman in me.
Right.
Saying all these things. That's certainly true.
Right. So I don't think there are any more questions, so we can close up this particular paper presentation, I guess. Okay, we have one. It's from Madhvendra. The question is, does the identity construction differ based on the experiences between different women communities in Bhojpuri folk song?
Yes, definitely. Depending on the kind of the caste that you belong to or the class that you come from, your experience of exploitation will definitely be there, but the amount or the kind will differ, and so the expression of that also differs. One of some songs may be more about, they're less of an articulation of their sexual desires, whereas in the songs coming from lower caste women, since they're also continuous wage earners, they feel more confident to articulate the unfulfillment of those sexual desires and of other atrocities as well. So definitely caste and class, they are always continuously interlining.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, wherein at one place we can talk about the collective experiences, we cannot deny the existence of individualized lived experiences, and I guess that's the beauty of these songs and folk tales, that they bring out all such stories to light. Anyway, thank you so much, Sumaya and Yashika, for the very interesting presentation.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having us. It's a wonderful opportunity. We'd like to thank the department as well.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay. So moving on to our next paper, we have Pavitra Kumari here with us. She'll be presenting her paper on Ambivalent Fairies, Interrogating Representations of Femininity and Haryanvi Folktales. Over to you, Pavitra.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Shruti. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Okay. Uh, so good afternoon, everyone. I'm Pavitra. I'm a research scholar on folkloristics at Department of Modern Indian Languages and Literary Studies. I'm also teaching in the English Department of College of Vocational Studies. I would want to thank all the organizers, Patnaik sir, moderators who have given me like this opportunity to share my ideas here. So the paper that I'm going to present today is titled Ambivalent Fairies Interrogating Representations of Femininity in Haryanvi Folktales. I am not going to waste any time in talking about the characteristics of folklore because I think a lot of speakers before me have done a good job at that. So keeping the paucity of time in mind, I'm directly going to jump on to the themes of my paper and the concerns of my paper. So when we talk about fairy tales of Haryanvi folklore, it is important to be conscious of the fact that these are tales that are often narrated to children by women within domestic spaces. Hence, their primary function is didactic. The tales are intended to pass on traditional knowledge and belief systems in an entertaining manner. So they can also be looked at and seen as vehicles of cultural conditioning. Apart from this, the idea that these are tales told by women who are commenting on women's place within a culture, one has to take into account the psychological implications of the same in psychosexual development of the children. The second thing that becomes, I think, important is the idea that how the subgenre of fairy tales falls into the category of fantasy. And fantasies often provide us alternative spaces and lenses to look at the cultural reality from alternative perspectives. So that would be important. To me, what became really interesting while I was researching was the idea that the most powerful women would only feature in fantasies. So hundreds of tales and folk tales that have been told in Haryana, these women will only feature and will be protagonist in stories that are not realistic. The world of fantasy also distinguishes female characters who belong to the mortal realm, hence within the parlance of society and civilization, and those who are beyond it, fairies and witches. This highlights their peripheral existence, right? And for this paper, I have taken two fairy tales, and I'm going to try to examine the radicalism, iconoclasm, or that the subgenre purports to offer. So the two tales that I've chosen are called Pariyan Rajkumar, Fairies and the Princess, and Raja Ka Supna, King's Dream. So the first fairy tale that I've picked up, the representation of the fairies is very negative. There, women are seen as dangerous. Before I move into a close analysis of the story, I want to point out that this anxiety about women who are beyond patriarchal control is not limited merely to fairy tales in Haryana, but is also reflected in social commentaries on female empowerment. Savitri Vashisht, in her book Haryana Ki Lok Sanskriti, expresses this anxiety in the section she has titled Haryanvi Samaj Mein Nari Ka Sthan. Her observations demonstrate the confusion and uneasiness towards feminism and women's liberation movements within traditional social circles. She says, and I quote, घूंघट से भले ही मुंह ना छिपाएं, मगर आंख की लाज बचाए रखनी है. The statement foregrounds the disquiet too much liberation can bring. It expresses like deep-seated fear and anxiety that male-dominated societies have of women who are in control. Hence, the author feels the necessity to evoke discourse of shame, which women are supposed to internalize of their own free will. In the same segment, she refers to love marriages as rogue, as in sickness, exposing patriarchy's dire need to control the bodies and their sexualities of women. Her discourse also establishes another important point, which is the prioritization of tradition over individual choices, which is also reflected in the 2 fairy tales that I have taken up. So I'm now going to jump right into the analysis of the stories. So a quick summary of the first story that I have taken. There is a king, there is a queen. The king cannot have children. This is my interpretation. The story does not say that the king cannot have children. The story says that the queens cannot conceive children. So a Mahatma visits the palace, gives him some herbs, and then the queens are able to conceive, and then they have 4 sons, and the astrologers predict that, princess would be powerful and strong, and all of that. So what we see in the first part of this particular fairy tale is that there is no reference to supernatural women. We are in a world of nobles, kings, and queens. And it is obviously unequivocally male-centered. The ideas of polygamy, emphasis on the need of the heirs for the king and his inability to have them. These are motives that recur in multiple tales in India. This reminds me of A.K. Ramanujan's understanding of folkloristics or folklore studies, where he did categorize folklore as a counter system, but he also went on to say, and I'm quoting him here, even counter systems are not autonomous, not entirely independent of other systems to which they respond. And so folklore overlaps with other expressive systems in India. Thus, we find within folklore alternatives to classical tradition as well as continuities to them. And so this similar theme you would find in Dashrath's childlessness in Ramayana, in Pandu's and Dhritarashtra's childlessness in Mahabharata. The conception of children requires intervention of a wise man or a Mahatma. But what to me is of most relevance here is how this childlessness has been represented. The queen's feelings and their regarding this issue are given no space in the narrative. Raja is baat se bada dukhi tha, meaning that the king was very sad. So the central concern is how the king feels. The queens and their feelings regarding the issue are not given any space. And it also appears that the narrative blames the childlessness on the women. Unme te kisi ke bhi balak nahi hue the, meaning none of them were able to conceive. It is somehow established as solely the fault of these women that they're unable to conceive. Moreover, it seems to be the only function of mortal women in these stories. This provides the emphasis to emphasize that women's identities are inevitably derived from their social and reproductive functions. Now, next, what is also interesting to me is that, when the astrologer prophesizes about the son, he says that they're going to grow into powerful and strong men. So again, there are these masculine characteristics that are being superimposed on a male body. So again, it's very deterministic in its understanding that if you're born in a male body, then you're going to grow and be masculine. So all of that is there. And it's very beautifully represented through the idea of fate. The fantastical element of the narrative enters only in the second half, where the 4 princes, they are not allowed to go to south. But one day they are hunting and they go to south, and then there are these 4 fairies who are bathing there, and then they kidnap them, and then they drag them to their abode, and they imprison them, and they plan to eat them on an auspicious date. So now, interestingly, all of this this action takes place in the interiors of a dense forest, right? So this in itself is a recurring motif, not only in Haryanvi fairy tales, but in many fairy tales. The geographical imagination and the spatial politics serve as important symbols in helping us navigate through the gender dynamics as well as the dominant cultural and political biases in the tales. Firstly, forests represent nature, and they're juxtaposed against the kingdom that represents culture, nurture, civilization. Not only are tales like this one anthropocentric, the perspective that is foregrounded is usually that of the state. Thus, forests also become spaces where human civilizations, with their focus on human rationality, logic, tendency for order, are called into challenge. And one will not be far away from the truth to say that these characteristics have been traditionally associated with masculinity. The forest, therefore, is not only at the margins of human civilization, but also the limit of the conscious, comprehensible, controlled world of humans. The forest is the home of the other. This is a space that inhabits all which that cannot be clearly categorized. The anxieties and fears that are supposed to be suppressed and exiled into the unconscious. The default association of the feminine and the other culture with these ideas is an expression of dominant patriarchal and racial colonial appropriations. So I'm moving on. From here, so the idea is that even the women who are in forest, they demonstrate alternative femininities. The narrative representation reiterates the regressive stereotypes, so it's very ambivalent there, what we're trying to say. The dichotomies are also highlighted by juxtaposing ideal women who occupy domestic space within the palaces, the queens, against dangerous fairies in the forest. So, and also what's interesting to observe is that how often these women are masculinized. This brings us to the next point in our analysis, which is that of the gaze that frames these narratives. These are tales of masculine gaze, on that one that perceives feminine world as illogical, intuitive, and wild, and which needs to be tamed by rational masculine power. And this is demonstrated using the metaphor of hunting. But again, there is a unique subversion in this tale, because it's not the fairies who are hunted, but the men who are hunted. So you see that particular subversion there, and they are dragged into a female space that men are usually very scared of. So this idea of women who are outside the limits of control, but they're also seen as cannibalistic, right? Devouring men. So this idea of women outside the limits of control as all devouring and excessive is also a common trope across cultures and literatures. So it should not come as a surprise that therefore that these evil fairies are dominantly non-maternal, in fact anti-maternal in their function. This connotation separates these women from devis or goddesses who are emblematic of fertility and maternity. The rejection of socially sanctioned roles of mothers and wives, despite having a female body, adds to another challenge their presence poses, especially in contradiction to the representation of queens of the high society. Another interesting thing for me when I was looking at the stories was the subversion of the cautionary tales. Usually when we're looking at cautionary tales, they are meant for women. But here we have a cautionary tales which is meant for men, not for women. So that's interesting. People tell them not to go somewhere. Okay, I'm skipping all of this because I'm sure I'm running out of time. So also the spaces are mutually exclusive. Okay, so if the princes can't travel south, the fairies can't travel north. And what is interesting here, for me at least, is that that the mutual exclusiveness of the spaces is not real impossibility of crossing the boundaries, because the princes do get into the forest. But the condition and inherited suspicion towards the other. So that is there. Yes. The second tale that I have taken up is I forgot a very important point here, which is that when we're talking about the cautionary tales, the evil fairies embody fear. They become medium through which children can be taught to obey, because we need to remember that these are stories that are being told to children. So children can be taught to obey and not indulge in behavior deemed unacceptable by a community. So this story highlights glorification of obedience for authority, traditional knowledge, and social structures as a virtue within the culture, irrespective of gender. So the evil fairies seem to be the mode of disciplining actions for young in the community. So that is there. Now I'm moving on to the second tale, which is called the Raja Ka Supna. Shruti, can you tell me how much time I have? 5? Okay, thanks. So it's called King's Dream, okay? So the title already seems to indicate the male-centeredness, because it's about the a dream of a king. And also that most of the men who feature in the stories come from upper caste, upper class, adds on to their privilege, right? So the story goes on like this. I'm just going to summarize it quickly, right? So the king has a dream in which he is in Indra's abode and enjoying exotic fruits and company of beautiful fairies. His wife happens to wake him up at the exact moment when the fairies are about to begin their dance for entertaining men at the assembly. The king wakes up furious and he exiles his wife for ruining his dream. The premise of the tale is obviously very patriarchal, and all women are reduced to being objects of service of men around them, whether mortal or supernatural. Moreover, the male gaze fixes their identities in the text. So this wife is bound to the domestic space with no control over her body. This image of a woman enclosed by the walls of domesticity exposes the alienation from an external world that is imposed upon her. Similarly, even fairies are denied agency or identity beyond any purposes that they may serve for men. They are just figments of the imagined fantasy of a man. So they're manipulated to be servile to male fantasy. So we can see few of these motives. Okay, I think I can skip this portion. So, but these fairies you would see are not potentially dangerous because they're mere figments of male desire and fantasy. So they can be controlled. Uh, the patriarchal control over woman's body and sexuality is emphasized here. The wife's body toils away, performing her domestic duties, and the fairy's beauty exists only for the admiration for the male gaze. Now, this particular story records a wrongdoing and expresses the injustice of it. This idea reminds one of a long tradition of tales of Pativrata Stree, wronged by a husband or society. And I would want to refer to Sudhir Kakkar in this context, who is a Indian psychoanalyst. And he says that, for the Indian psyche, Sita forms the ego ideal. And parallels can be drawn between the folklore I have taken up. So the ideal of the womanhood incorporated by Sita and the queen in this context is one of chastity, purity, and gentle tenderness and singular faithfulness, which cannot be destroyed or even disturbed by her husband's rejections, slights, or thoughtlessness. Sita's legend also gives us a glimpse in the Hindu imagery of manliness. Ram may have all the traits of godlike hero, yet he's also fragile, mistrustful, and jealous and conformist, both to parents' wishes and the social opinion. These expectations too, an Indian girl incorporates gradually in her inner world. So that's something that's very important for us to note. And we find such women, right? We find Sita in Ramayana, Shakuntala in Abhigyan Shakuntalam, Kanaki in Silapatikaram. These women and their reputations are redeemed in the end, but these are all women who follow staunchly the rules laid down by patriarchy. The sense of injustice is evoked in the narrative of women who have complied with the societal expectations, right? So that is there. As in other narratives with similar motives, the saving grace for the queen who is exiled here, who's no longer fulfilling the social role of a daughter or a wife, is motherhood, right? The exiled wife is given a purpose to live in form of a son. It should be pointed out, without any exception, these characters always give birth to sons. Within the traditional patriarchal framework, a daughter would be liability. A son, a ray of hope. For a son provides patriarchal protection that to a mother that is deemed indispensably necessary for her. So when the queen is exiled, again, she goes to the forest. So again, this motive of women in forest, becoming a space for the outcasts becomes crucial. And Banjara, the head of a Banjara community, adopts her. Again, the idea that, usually the benefactors of these clans that live consciously in isolation, their morals differ from that of the dominant state. And hence they can provide a space for women wronged by the male heads of states. So that's what's happening here. So she gives birth to this son. How much time, Shruti?
I was about to interrupt you, but it's going on in such a nice flowy manner that I just could not find time to do that. But yeah, you just have like 1 or 2 more.
Yeah, I can conclude in 2 minutes. Yeah. So what happens is that the queen gives birth to a son, right? And so one day he's going out to attend some sort of a festival in the neighboring village, and he detours. So this detouring is another motive in fairy tales. And while he's detouring, he finds these 4 fairies who are playing something near a well. Now, this idea of the well is employed, which is a hiding place for women who are abandoned, or fairies and witches. This is a recurring motif, at least in Haryanvi folk tales. So the well with its womb-like structure can be interpreted as being an exclusively female space. However, since the gaze describing these images is usually male, they are seen as dark, all-engulfing spaces which are to be admired as they are feared. Referring to other womb-like enclosures, Susan Gubar and Sandra Gilbert describe them as house of earth, secret and often sacred. Women returning to nature is not a new image in Indian classical literature. Sita being engulfed by earth and taken back into its womb is one of the most powerful images in Hindu cultural consciousness. So one can witness women in these tales struggling to free themselves of their anatomical nature, their biological destiny, as you would call it. Not only can they not escape the womb, they are defined by it. At the same time, the womb represents access to dark knowledge buried in caves. Hence, the fear in men who find themselves close or lost in these female spaces. So, okay, I'm going to skip this idea about the other queen. So finally, what happens in this particular tale is that the son is able to fulfill the dream of the father with the help of the fairies. The fairies help him, they give him a divine conch, and when he blows onto that divine conch, Indra's aboard and the fairies appear. So the tale ends in the triumph of the virtuous wife and king's apology, and all of them living happily ever after. Here, I want to talk about the Indian Oedipus that has been talked about by A.K. Ramanujan. Okay, just 30 seconds. 30 seconds. A.K. Ramanujan and by Sudhir Kakkar. Both of them talk about the Indian Oedipus, where they displace the Indian Oedipus by Yayati complex, where they say that in India, the aggression of the father towards the son is what you would see more. Son willingly gives up his political and sexual potency, and the father is always an victorious oppressor. So, Sudhir Kakkar goes on to say that motivated by the Yayati complex, the older generation dominates society in the Indian worldview, which is also seen in Haryanvi folk tales. Also, the last idea that I want to talk about here is that, the queen in the end is rewarded, but this is what she says. तन्ने तो सुपना ही आया था और मेरी कुंख का जन्म लेने ने असली सुरग में पहुंचा दिया. So she talks about, she's very conscious about the fact that she uses the word kunk, which means womb. And she says that, you only dreamt about it, but someone who took birth from my womb was able to fulfill your dream. He did that. So her redemption is founded in and steeped into her womb, and her acceptance and dependence on femininity and femaleness as defined and arranged by the society. So yeah, I think I can end here. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Pavitra. That was indeed a very expressive presentation, or rather, I may say it was a very nice paper performance instead of paper presentation. So thank you so much for that. Very interesting take on the fairy tales, especially when you yourself appeared to be a storyteller. And I mean, also the subversion elements that you took from the tales, and how you subverted how you also, in your interpretation of these tales, you constantly made us aware that this is what tales is, but this is what I take from it. So, yeah, very interesting indeed. And I guess there are no questions, but it's flooded with comments. The chat box is flooded with comments. Uh, right. Ruchirana says, very interesting how similar cautionary tales around fairies could be found in the central Himalayan region. There, these narratives are also directed towards men. Also, the idea of forest in the collective imagination around this theme was both critical and creatively put. Thank you, Pavitra. Enjoying your presentation.
Maybe someday we can do a comparative study of the fairy tales in Himachal and in Haryana, and could come up with something interesting.
Yeah, you have more compliments from Isha, who says, really well presented, Pavitra. Loved the structure of your presentation. Madhvendra says, insightful and informative paper, very well presented too. Thank you, best wishes. Ankita Sethi says, Pavitra, thanks for transporting us to the world of fairies. It is indeed a well articulated and insightful paper. As you mentioned about the evil fairies, as they don't fall into stereotypical images, could you please elaborate on the tricks used by supernatural beings?
Yeah, that's a very important question, and that's something that actually recurs in a lot of fairy tales, where fairies use trickery in order to seduce men. And this idea of trickery has an entire cultural and political discourse behind it. Trickery is often seen as a weapon of the weak, and it adds on to the discourse of women as someone who uses guile and manipulation. So it also goes on to show us that how there is an acute lack of actual social and political power that women can actually have, that they have to depend on ideas of beauty, ideas of trickery in order to do whatever they want to. Also, in one of the stories, what I found was very interesting, that one of the fairies uses trickery in order to help the prince. And there, the representation of trickery was not negative. So what's interesting here is that the moralistic framework of the society does not have a problem with the idea of trickery, but for the intention with it is used. So if you use trickery in order to save or protect the dominant order, it would be celebrated. Otherwise, it would be vilified. Yeah.
Okay, so we have 5 minutes left for your discussion, and we have two questions. Depending on how you answer them, we'll be able to take them. So we have a question from Amitav sir. In the second story, are the women of Indra Sabha Paris and not Apsaras? If such is the case, how will you explain this? And he has a second question also. How will you interpret the central / continuity of the presence of such fairies in an extremely patriarchic society like that of Haryana?
Okay, thank you, Amita, for your question. So, in the second story, women of Indra Sabha are Pari, they are not Apsaras. So, all the tales that I have been able to collect and read from secondary sources, there are no references to Apsaras, there are only Paris. Right? So, how would I explain this? Probably the answer would lie in how the mythology and the religious atmosphere in Haryana is created. How will you interpret the central continuity of presence of such fairies in an extremely patriarchic society like that of Haryana? As I said at the beginning of my presentation, that these are stories that are told to children by women. So presence of such fairies, because there are women in each culture, there would be women who are transgressive. So the culture also has to prepare its children for transgressive women, right? Or women who are outside the culture. So not only so what's happening here is that the purpose is actually dual here, right? And the dual function is one, that this is what you have to become, right? These are the ideals that we're setting for you. Become like them and not become like that, right? Disciplining them, telling them that, if you're going to transgress, then you're going to be punished for it, right? So inducing that kind of fear, and developing and disciplining them towards a certain kind of obedience, towards glorifying obedience to authority. And third, also preparing them and culturally conditioning them against certain kinds of women. So it has to be there, no culture, if it has to be successful, negate the presence of strong women. So what you need to do is you have to create myths around them and condition your children so that once they meet women like that, they already have preconceived notions about what to think about them, probably. So like, this is again my own interpretation. I'm not sure of, because I haven't interviewed, I haven't talked about it to people. So yeah.
Okay, we have two more questions, but we don't have much time. Maybe quickly you can respond to either of them. One is by Urvishi Kuhad. The question is, are these stories restricted to any area? Most often grandmothers would narrate stories about the daily life in village.
Yeah. So the stories are, for me, I have taken up from stories that were told to me by my grandmother. So which is an area near Hisar. So I'm not sure if such stories are, true. And also these stories with slight variations are also present near areas of Narnod in India. Of Haryana. So they're there as well.
Yeah. So there are a couple of more compliments. I'm sure you can respond to them in chat. And I would just focus on the question. The last one is by Ruchi Rana. She asks, could you tell us the relevance of using the word ambivalent in the title to define fairies in the Haryanvi context?
Absolutely right. Because the two stories that I had chosen were this. So on one hand, there are fairies that are helpful, that men would desire, that are a part of the accepted idea of what women are supposed to be. So they help men, right? So they are celebrated, their presence is celebrated. On the other hand, there are fairies who are feared, right, and who are all devouring. So these are very two oppositional representations of fairies, and in both the cases, the word that has been used, the phrase that has been used to describe them is pari. So, who is the pari? Is the pari the one who devours, who's outside there, ready to get you? Or is the pari there to help you and, resolve all your issues? So, and that to me at least is like a reflection of ambivalence. And that's why I quoted the social commentaries that are present on feminism and women's liberations movement in Haryana, that you want women to be liberated, you want feminism to be there, but that feminism and that liberation has to have a limit. The response to it is very ambivalent. So that's there. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pavitra, for that
Thank you everyone
entire.
for the patience and
Yeah,
for
it
being
was
here.
indeed very interesting and very expressive, I must mention again. Okay, with that, we move on to the next paper presentation. The paper is titled Folk Arts in the Past, Present and Future, a critical analysis of folk arts in Malayalam cinema. This will be presented by Miss Arya CA. So, Arya, I would request you to kindly switch on your camera and audio.
Shruti, she is actually not.
She's not present.
She is not present. I think if she is there, we would request her to raise her hand. Then we will make her co-host. Once again, you just announce if the person is there.
Arya, if you're here, please raise your hand.
No, Mr. or Miss Arya, we don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, Aisha Tyagi also. If she is not there, then we would. Once again, one small request: if Mr. or Miss Arya, if you are available, please raise your hand. Otherwise, switch on video. I think person is not available. If it is not available, then we can close the session. We are going to meet at announce that information.
So with that, we come to an end of the 12th session of the national webinar on multidisciplinary approaches to folklife, challenges and perspectives, organized by Department of Modern Indian Languages, Literary Studies, University of Delhi. I must mention how culturally and geographically rich this particular session was. We began with African American aesthetics and went on to touching India's East, West, and we would have touched South as well had Arya been present. So yeah, with the presentations on Bhojpuri song, Haryanvi folktales and Malayalam cinema, had she been there. So I'm indeed honored to have had the privilege of moderating this session. And I'd like to extend my gratitude to Patnaik sir, to Ramaiya sir, to all the paper presenters, participants, and patient audience for successful conduction of this session, and would like to take this opportunity to invite you all um, to the special lecture on Sarla Mahabharat, the art of storytelling by Professor B.N. Patnaik, that starts at 6 p.m. So thank you very much. May you all stay